Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 183 and it's titled What If We Restarted the Game? And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Luke over on Discord/Patreon. And that card is Bearer of the Heavens, which is a massive 7 and a red, so 8 mana for a 10/10 giant. But when Bearer of the Heavens dies, destroy all permanents at the beginning of the next end step. So this is a very unique card. There's a lot going into it. But the key wording on here is the destroy all permanents aspect. This is not destroy all non-land permanents. This will destroy lands, creatures, artifacts, enchantments, planeswalkers. Anything that's on board will get blown up when this thing dies. And it's a 10/10, so there's a very good chance that our opponents are not going to want to kill it. So with that in mind, how do we pick a commander that fits what we're trying to do? And the short answer is, what if our commander is indestructible and cannot be destroyed when Bearer of the Heavens dies? And that is where Purphoros Bronze Blooded comes in. So Purphoros is 4 and a red for a 7/6 legendary enchantment creature god. He's got indestructible, and as long as your devotion to red is less than 5, Purphoros isn't a creature. Other creatures you control have haste, and you can pay 2 and a red and put a red creature card or an artifact creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So there's a couple of key things that we can do with Purphoros, but you may notice that we can use his ability to put Bearer of Heavens into play, meaning that we will sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step, and then at the beginning of the next end step, everything is going to be destroyed. But Purphoros has indestructible, so we do get to keep our commander. Now, because of that, there's some other kind of shenanigans we can figure out. But let's take a look at some of the themes for our deck and figure out what else we're trying to do with it. So first, alongside Purphoros, we have other indestructible creatures, permanents, whether that's lands, artifacts, whatever, because we want to make sure that when Bearer of the Heavens goes off, we are in the best situation among all of the players at the table. So another example for this is Hazaret the Fervent, which is 3 and a red for a 5/4 legendary creature god. She has indestructible and haste, but she can't attack or block unless you have 1 or fewer cards in hand, and we can pay 3 to discard a card and have Hazaret deal 2 damage to each opponent. So this is another great way for us to put a bunch of creatures in play and then not have to worry about them getting blown up. But like I said, this also applies to some of our lands, it applies to some of our mana rocks and some of our artifacts. We really just want to make sure that when Bearer of the Heavens is destroyed, we're the only person at the table left with anything in play. That, though, leads us into our next theme, which is just going to be creatures with death triggers. Since Purphoros forces us to sacrifice our creatures, and since Bearer of the Heavens is going to force us to destroy our creatures, we want to make sure that we get some sort of benefit from our creatures dying. So a good example of that is Atsushi the Blazing Sky, which is 2 red for a 4/4 legendary creature dragon spirit. It's got flying and trample, and when it dies, choose 1. We can either exile the top 2 cards of our library, and until the end of our next turn we may play those cards, or we can create 3 treasure tokens. Now, the 3 treasure tokens is actually incredibly important because if this dies to a Bearer of the Heavens and we lose everything but Purphoros, those 3 treasure tokens are enough for us to be able to put another creature in play, and then we have some shenanigans with maybe some other death triggers or things like that. So Atsushi is very important for what we're trying to do, and it's a great example of some of the death triggers we're looking to get. And then finally, we have our last theme of the deck, which is just giant creatures. And more specifically, we want giant creatures that, like Atsushi, do something when they die. So a good example of that is Phyrexian Triniform, which is a 9 mana 9/9 artifact creature Phyrexian Golem. And it says when it dies, create 3 3/3 Golem artifact creature tokens, plus it has Encore for 12. So if we have, say, the setup where we have Purphoros, Bearer of the Heavens, and Atsushi. Everything dies. We keep Purphoros and nothing else. We have our 3 treasure tokens from Atsushi. We can use those to put Phyrexian Triniform into play, hit somebody for 9, sacrifice it at the end of turn, and then we still have 3 3/3s left over, meaning we have quite a fast clock on the rest of the table when nobody else has any other lands or creatures or artifacts or anything else that they can do. So this is really what we're trying to do with this deck, is just put a ton of huge creatures into play, maybe sacrifice them, maybe find something that cares about when they die, and then just slowly grind out a victory, preferably when our opponents have nothing else on the board. So those are all of our themes for this week, and the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some key cards in the deck. And the very first key card that I want to highlight is going to be Arni Metalbrow. This is a card that, if I'm being perfectly honest, I completely forgot about as I was building this deck until it showed up, and I realized that it is perfect for what we're trying to do. It's 2 and a red for a 3/3 human berserker. Whenever a creature you control attacks, or a creature enters the battlefield under your control attacking, you may pay 1 and a red. If you do, you may put a creature card with mana value less than that creature's mana value from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. So it's a lot of words, but basically what it's saying is we can attack with something like Phyrexian Triniform, which is 9 mana, after putting it into play off of Purphoros, and then we can pay 2 to put something that's 8 mana value or less into play that's also tapped and attacking. Importantly, Arni Metalbrow does not sacrifice the thing it puts in. We just get that creature into play for free, well, for 2 mana at the very least. And so this is a great way for us to go from, say, 9 mana with Phyrexian Triniform to something that's 8 mana, and then since that 8 mana creature came in tapped and attacking, that actually triggers Arni again. So if we had, say, 16 mana and the ability to go from 9, 8, 7, 6 all the way down to 1, we could put that many creatures into play tapped and attacking, which can drastically change the way that combat's going to go that turn. So Arni is perfect for what we're trying to do, and it's great for when we're cheating into play these massive creatures, because then we can cheat into play more massive creatures that we don't have to sacrifice. So Arni, perfect for what we're doing, and I can't believe I forgot about him before this deck. Moving in to our next key card. This one is going to be Stalking Vengeance. So Stalking Vengeance is 5 red for a 5/5 avatar with haste. Whenever another creature you control dies, it deals damage equal to its power to target player or planeswalker. This is, again, kind of perfect for what we're trying to do, because we intend a lot of our big creatures to die at the end of every turn, so if we have something like the Phyrexian Triniform, which is a 9 power creature, we can hit somebody for 9, then it dies at the end of turn, triggering Stalking Vengeance, and we hit someone for another 9 damage. This is going to be incredibly useful as we fill up our board with a ton of creatures, and it's also important to remember that this triggers when the Vengeance dies as well, as long as it's dying at the same time as other things. So if there's a huge board wipe and it kills everything, Stalking Vengeance will still see everything else die and still do all of that damage to our opponents, so it kind of prevents our opponents from wanting to wipe the board. But it also acts as a secondary win condition if we wipe the board with something like Bearer of the Heavens. All right, moving on to our final key card. This one is going to be Harrogast Erupting Nullkite. So Harrogast is 9 mana for a 6/6 legendary creature Eldrazi dragon. It has Emerge for 6 red. When you cast this spell, you may exile your hand. If you do, draw 3 cards. Then it also has Flying, and each creature spell you cast has Emerge, and the Emerge cost is equal to its mana cost. So it's very important to note that Purphoros only says we can cheat into play red creatures or artifact creatures, so I tried really hard to make sure that we could cheat into play all of our creatures. Harrogast, you'll notice, is colorless but not an artifact, so Harrogast is actually the only creature in the entire deck that we cannot cheat into play with Purphoros. But I think that it's strong enough that it still earns its place regardless, because this is going to let us cast all of our expensive creatures for very, very cheap, and we can then use the creatures that are going to die anyway with Purphoros, having snuck them into play, we can use those to emerge into other creatures and get these giant creatures for very, very cheap, and in some cases even for free, depending on if they're colorless, to kind of just come out of nowhere. Because we've got all of these creatures that we put into play for cheap, we now have to sacrifice them, so we may as well just use them for something else. And then Harrogast is going to be letting us do that while also drawing us cards when it enters the battlefield. So Harrogast really does do everything we want it to do, and it very much earns its spot in the deck despite the fact that we can't use Purphoros to put it into play. Anyway, those are all of our key cards for this deck. So the next thing we got to do is take a look at some cool interactions in this deck. These are cards that synergize very well with each other, and in some cases can either be win conditions or value engines just on their own. So the very first pair of cards that I want to talk about is going to be Anax Hardened in the Forge and Thermopod. So Anax is 1 red for a star 3 legendary enchantment creature demigod. Anax's power is equal to your devotion to red, and whenever Anax or another non-token creature you control dies, create a 1/1 red satyr creature token with this creature can't block, and if the creature had power 4 or greater, create 2 of those tokens instead. So this is a huge way for us to really benefit from having to sacrifice our own creatures, because if we sacrifice our entire board, we then replace them with 1/1 satyrs, and yes, they're not great, but they're at least better than nothing. And so we can also combine that up with Thermopod, which is 4 and a red for a 4/3 snow creature slug, and we can pay a snow mana, and Thermopod gains haste until the end of turn. There is no snow mana in this deck. That is a completely irrelevant ability. The reason it's here, though, is for its second ability, which says sacrifice a creature, add red to your mana pool. This is going to be one of the best ramp engines in the entire deck, because we can take all of our creatures that have already attacked that we have to sacrifice anyway because of Purphoros, sacrifice them to Thermopod, make a ton of red mana, cast some other big beefy creatures out of our hand, make a ton of satyrs, and then if we still need more mana to cast more stuff, we can then sacrifice the satyrs for even more mana with Thermopod. So this is a huge swing in our favor, especially if we're able to cheat in some big creatures that can make multiple satyrs when they die. This is a great way for us to cast a lot of our big threats legitimately in a deck that normally just wants to cheat things into play. But that is only cool interaction number 1. Cool interaction number 2 is going to look a little bit different. This one is between Feldon of the Third Path and Triplicate Titan. So Feldon is 1 red for a 2/3 legendary creature human artificer. You can pay 2 and a red and tap him to create a token that's a copy of target creature card in your graveyard, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. It gains haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So if we put a giant creature in our graveyard, like say Triplicate Titan, we can then use this ability every single turn. And Triplicate Titan is 9 mana for a 9/9 artifact creature golem. It has flying, vigilance, and trample, and when it dies, create a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token with flying, a 3/3 golem with vigilance, and a 3/3 golem with trample. So it essentially splits itself into 3. But because that happens when it dies, we can get Triplicate Titan into the graveyard somehow, maybe through Purphoros, and then we can use Feldon to make a token copy of it. We can attack with it, it's still a 9/9. Then at the end of turn, we sacrifice it to get 3 more golems, and we can repeat that process next turn, now attacking with our 9/9 and our 3/3 golems, and we can continue this process until hopefully our opponents are all knocked out of the game, or we get to a point where maybe they've just had enough and have to exile one of these 2 combo pieces. But it is a great way to ensure that we always have a ton of damage ready to go and always have something we can be doing. But that is cool interaction number 2. So next we're going to move on to the budget portion of this deck tech and talk about the actual price of the deck. So this week, our deck's price came in at $72.10, and the most expensive card in the entire deck was Dark Steel Plate at $7.79. So Dark Steel Plate, 3 mana for an artifact equipment. It has Indestructible, and equipped creature has Indestructible, equip for 2. Normally, this winds up in decks that want to take good care of its commander, but our commander's already indestructible, so this doesn't actually do that in this deck. But what it does do is it lets us protect pretty much anything from Bearer of the Heavens when that effect goes off. So this allows us to protect maybe a combo piece, maybe something like Feldon or Haragast, something we really want to keep around. But it is incredibly expensive. Turns out giving Indestructible in colorless is a pretty expensive ability, so it does make up about 1/10 of our deck's price all on its own. So if you did need to trim for budget purposes, this is a card you could cut. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit outside of the normal budget, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. So this time, I would recommend putting in Blightsteel Colossus and taking out Darksteel Gargoyle. Now, this looks a little bit strange because typically I go out of my way to not recommend things that could be considered staples, and I do think Blightsteel Colossus qualifies as a staple card, especially in Purphoros, but I really think it does deserve a spot in this deck if you have the budget for it, because it is 12 mana for an 11/11 artifact creature golem. It has trample, infect, and indestructible, and if it would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, reveal it and shuffle it into its owner's library instead. So with Purphoros, we can pay 3 mana to put this into play with haste, and then immediately hit someone for 11 infect damage and knock them out of the game. That is incredibly powerful and can come pretty much out of nowhere, especially because the Colossus has trample. Additionally, if we ever do get the chance to cast it for just 12 mana, then it is also indestructible, so it doesn't die to Bearer of the Heavens. And when we have to sacrifice it to Purphoros, then it just gets shuffled back into our library and we have the chance to draw it again. So Blightsteel Colossus, yes, it is a bit of a staple card. I think that it earns a spot in this deck because it's just that good. It does everything we want it to be doing. It's a one-shot on some people, and it just makes the deck kind of function a lot better. Now, if you are putting in a card, then you do obviously have to take one out, and as much as I didn't want to recommend taking out an indestructible card, I don't think Darksteel Gargoyle is good enough to warrant its place in the deck, because it is 7 mana for an artifact creature gargoyle, it's a 3/3, it has flying, and it's indestructible. And that's it. That is all it does. It does nothing else special. And part of the issue I have with Darksteel Gargoyle in this deck is that unlike Blightsteel Colossus, which can just take somebody out of the game when it hits them, Darksteel Gargoyle is doing 3 damage. And if we're casting it with Purphoros, we only get it until the end of turn. It's not super great. And if we're saving up for a 7 mana 3/3 with flying that just kind of gets blocked by most walls in the game, I don't think it's doing us much favors in the long run, so I don't think Darksteel Gargoyle is a great include for this deck. Granted, obviously it is significantly cheaper. It's $30 cheaper than Blightsteel Colossus, so if you're keeping it in for budget purposes, that makes complete sense to me. That's why it's here. But if you don't mind spending a little bit more on the Blightsteel Colossus, I do think that would be a much better inclusion for the deck. Now, with all of that being said, before we get into a game, because of course we got to test how this deck actually works in a game, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. As always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. And as always, if you have any comments, any cards you would like to see turned into videos for this channel eventually, please do put them in the comments below. I do try my best to get to all of them. However, if you're looking for the guarantee that any card you suggest will be turned into a deck eventually, for that you'd have to join our Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member, because that is a guarantee I give to our patrons and channel members in a way that I can't give to everybody else, even though I will of course certainly try. Plus you get a bunch of other cool stuff as well. So a huge shout out to our current patrons and channel members. So a thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Huey, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven van Nimwegen, Patty Whack, Keegan Tawney, and Jakar. So to all of you, thank you all so much. And without any further ado, let's jump into our game. So this week, we are of course being joined by 3 opponents, and I'm going to give you a bit of a warning before I put them on screen. This may be the most full we've ever had a gameplay screen, because we have not just one companion at the table, we have 2 companions at the table, and one is with a partner deck. So including our commander, there's a grand total of 7 creatures in command zones in this game, which is a huge number, almost double what a normal commander game would be. So starting off, we have AngryCow playing Sisay Weatherlight Captain with his companion Jegantha the Wellspring. We have Doodle playing Daragaz Reincarnated. And we have Mike playing Owen Grady Raptor Trainer and his partner Blue Loyal Raptor and their companion Karuga the Macro Sage. So starting off with Cow and his Sisay/Jegantha deck, this is a background style deck. So we have seen this deck on the channel before. Really what Cow wants to do is use Sisay's ability to search out all of the backgrounds because they are legendary permanents, and then use them to turn Sisay into a bit of a Voltron monster and use her to just kind of knock down her opponents. And since none of the backgrounds really have multiple color restrictions, that means Jegantha's a very easy include here and a great way to pay for Sisay's ability. Moving on to Doodle's Daragaz deck. This is actually the Daragaz deck that we have featured on this channel before. This is the Earthlink deck that Doodle actually suggested. He wound up liking the deck so much that he went out and bought it for himself. There have been a couple of upgrades, I believe, that he's done to it, but for the most part, it does remain our original list. So I will make sure to put a link to that original list right here so you can check it out. And last but not least, we have Mike with his dinosaur deck with Owen Grady Raptor Trainer, Blue Loyal Raptor, and their companion Karuga the Macro Sage. So this deck is nothing in it is below 3 mana, which is why he's got Karuga in the companion zone, but it is all about dinosaurs. So he just wants to play the biggest, baddest dinosaurs he can, knock people down, take people out, trample over creatures, and just do a ton of damage. And this is a deck that has shown up on the channel before, but unfortunately it didn't quite get its feet off the ground. It didn't do everything it wanted to do. So I'm very excited that it gets a second chance to showcase what it can do, because I know dinosaurs can be very scary if they get the right gameplay going. So with all of that being said, let me know down in the comments which deck you think is going to win this game. There's definitely a lot of cool decks here, definitely a lot going on. So let me know what you think. Let me know if there's any deck you think is our biggest threat at the table. But with all of that being said, I hope you all enjoyed the deck tech. Hope you will enjoy the game. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Cow goes first, followed by myself, Doodle, and then Mike. On Cow's first turn, he plays a forest. I play a Spine Rock Knoll, hiding away a card. Doodle plays a Riveteer's Outlook, which sacrifices itself, lets him gain a life, and then he searches his library for a forest, putting it into play tapped. Mike plays a Sheltered Thicket. Cow plays an island and casts Farseek, searching his library for a plains, putting it into play tapped. I play a Scavenger Grounds and cast Mindstone. Doodle plays a mountain and casts Rampant Growth, searching his library for a swamp and putting it into play tapped. Mike plays a forest. Cow plays an island and casts Fellwar Stone, then cast his commander Sisay Weatherlight Captain, which gets +1/+1 for each color among other legendary permanents he controls, and she can be activated to let Cow search his library for a legendary permanent with mana value less than Sisay's power, putting it into play. On my turn, I play a Desert of the Fervent and cast Nim Deathmantle. Doodle plays a Rocky Tar Pit, then at the end of turn, Mike cycles Titanoth Rex. On Mike's turn, he plays a mountain and casts Dryad of the Elysian Grove, letting his lands tap for mana of any color, and also letting him play an additional land each turn, which he does, playing a forest. Cow plays a Prismatic Vista and casts Guild Artisan, letting him make 2 treasure tokens whenever he attacks the opponent with the highest life total with Commander Sisay. This lets him attack Doodle for 3 and make 2 treasures. Before damage, Doodle casts Harrow, sacrificing a mountain and searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. In Cow's second main phase, he casts Shameless Charlatan, letting him pay 3 mana to turn Sisay into a copy of another creature. Then at the end of turn, I cycle Forgotten Cave. On my turn, I play a mountain and cast Fire Diamond. Doodle sacrifices his Rocky Tar Pit, searching his library for a mountain, putting it into play. He then plays a swamp and casts Lethal Vapors, destroying any creature that comes into play, but letting any player skip their next turn to destroy the Lethal Vapors. Mike casts Seta Sanctuary, letting him draw a card and discard a card in his upkeep if he controls a red or green permanent, or letting him draw 2 cards and discard a card in his upkeep if he controls both a red and green permanent. He then moves to combat and attacks Doodle for 2 with the Dryad. Cow plays an Evolving Wilds and attacks me for 4 with Sisay, making 2 treasure tokens. Then in his second main phase, he sacrifices both the Prismatic Vista and Evolving Wilds, losing a life, and searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into play untapped. After that, he cast Allied Strategies, drawing 5 cards since he controls 5 basic land types. I play a mountain and cast my commander Purphoros Bronze-Blooded, giving all my other creatures haste, and letting me put a creature into play from my hand for 3 mana, sacrificing it at the end of turn. Doodle plays a Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped, then casts Bedevil, destroying Sisay. In Mike's upkeep, he draws a card and discards a card, then casts Tranquil Frillback, paying an additional green mana when it enters to destroy target enchantment, destroying Doodle's Lethal Vapors. Unfortunately for Mike, this does still destroy the Frillback when it enters, so then he attacks Doodle for 2. Cow plays a forest and casts Noble Heritage, letting each player put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature they control in Cow's upkeep, but for each opponent that does, Cow gains protection from that player until his next turn. He then recast his commander Sisay, triggering the Noble Heritage and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on her, while all of his opponents choose not to put counters on their creatures. On my turn, I play a mountain and activate Purphoros twice, putting Phyrexian Triniform and Triplicate Titan into play. This lets me attack both Cow and Mike for 9. Then in my second main phase, since an opponent lost 7 or more life this turn, I can cast the spell Hidden Under Spine Rock Null for a single mana, letting me cast Harrogast Erupting Nullkite, discarding my hand to draw 3 cards, and also giving all my creatures a merge. When I move to my end step, I'm forced to sacrifice the Triniform and the Titan. However, when the Triniform dies, I create 3 3/3 golems, and when the Titan dies, I make 3 more 3/3 golems, but one has trample, one has flying, and one has vigilance. On Doodle's turn, he casts his commander, Daragaz Reincarnated. In Mike's upkeep, he draws a card and discards a card, then casts his commander, Owen Grady Raptor Trainer, which can tap to put a menace, trample, reach, or haste counter on target dinosaur. He then plays a Bountiful Landscape and a Wooded Foothills, and immediately sacrifices both of them to search his library for an island and a hedge maze, putting them into play tapped, surveilling 1 and losing a life. In Cow's upkeep, he puts 2 counters on Sisay, Doodle puts 2 counters on Daragaz, and Mike puts 2 counters on Dryad of the Elysian Grove, while I choose not to put counters on my creatures. After that, Cow plays a Swamp, and attacks me with Sisay for 9, making 2 more treasure tokens on attacks, but I block with a Golem, killing it and taking no damage. In Cow's second main phase, he casts Crystal Shard, letting him tap it to return a creature to its owner's hand unless that player pays 1. Unfortunately, since I'm tapped out, he's able to use it right away to return my Flying Golem to my hand. On my turn, I cast and kick a Skyclave relic, creating 2 tapped token copies of it when it enters the battlefield. I then attack Mike for 6 with Harrogast, and Cow for 6 with 2 golems. Before the blocks, Cow activates Sisei's ability, searching his library for a legendary permanent with mana value 8 or less, putting it into play. This lets him get Salumgar the Drifting Death, which blocks my golem with Vigilance, killing it so Cow only takes 3, while Mike still takes 6. On Doodle's turn, he casts a Frontier Siege, naming Khans when it enters, so that he adds 2 green mana at the beginning of each of his main phases. This lets him move to his second main phase and use the 2 green mana he gets to cast Earthlink, now forcing any player to sacrifice a land whenever a creature they control dies. In Mike's upkeep, he draws 2 cards and discards a card, plays an island, and casts Savage Order, sacrificing Dryad of the Elysian Grove, which also makes him sacrifice a forest, but then he's able to search his library for a dinosaur, putting it into play, letting him put Etali Primal Conqueror into play. This, in turn, makes each player reveal cards from the top of their library until they reveal a non-land card, letting Mike cast each of those cards for free. This ends with him casting his own Temur Ascendancy, giving all his creatures haste and letting him draw a card when a creature with power 4 or greater enters under his control, casting my Drakuseth Maw of Flames, and casting Cow's Villainous Wealth for X = 0, doing nothing, while choosing not to cast Doodle's Destructive Flow. He then attacks Doodle for 7 with Drakuseth, doing 4 damage to Daragaz and 3 damage to 2 of my golems, killing them. Then Doodle blocks the dragon with his commander, killing both of them, and forcing all 3 of us to sacrifice a land, while I sacrifice an additional one. In Mike's second main phase, he activates Owen Grady, putting a reach counter on Etali. In Cow's upkeep, he puts 2 +1/+1 counters on Sisei, and Mike puts 2 +1/+1 counters on Etali, but Doodle and I choose not to. Cow then activates Sisei, searching his library for Flaming Fist, putting it into play under his control, and giving Sisei double strike whenever she attacks. He attacks me with Sisei, making 2 treasures and giving her double strike. Before blocks, I activate Purphoros to put Myojin of Infinite Rage into play. Unfortunately, this leaves me tapped out, so I can't prevent Cow from using the Crystal Shard to return the Myojin to my hand, meaning I take 28 commander damage from Sisei, knocking me out of the game. In Doodle's upkeep, he pays 2 mana to keep Earthlink around, then plays a swamp and casts Crux of Fate, destroying all non-dragons. Before that resolves, Cow flashes in Kyodai, Soul of Kamigawa, giving Sisei Indestructible for as long as Kyodai is in play, meaning the only thing that Crux of Fate destroys is Owen Grady. Once that resolves, Doodle also casts Desolation, making each player who taps a land for mana sacrifice a land at the beginning of the next end step, forcing himself and Cow to sacrifice a land this turn. In Mike's upkeep, he draws 2 cards and discards a card, then plays Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, and attacks Doodle for 9 with Etali. In Cow's upkeep, he puts 2 counters on Sisei, and Mike puts 2 counters on Etali, while Doodle has no creatures, so he's unable to do so. Cow then casts a Soul Ring, and plays a Terramorphic Expanse, before casting Invasion of Zendikar, choosing Mike to defend it and searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. After that, he moves to combat, attacking Doodle with Sisei, giving her double strike and making 2 treasures, and also attacks his Invasion of Zendikar with Kyodai. This has Doodle taking 32 commander damage, knocking him out of the game, while Cow transforms his invasion into Awakened Skyclave. In his second main phase, Cow casts Feyburrow Elder, and at the end of turn, Mike mutates Sea Dasher Octopus under Etali, letting it now draw him a card whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent. Then, in Mike's upkeep, he draws 2 cards and discards a card, before casting Palani's Hatcher, giving his other dinosaurs haste and making 2 0/1 dinosaur egg tokens when it enters, one of which he sacrifices when he moves to combat to create a 3/3 dinosaur token. At the end of turn, Cow activates Sisei to search his library for Sword Coast Sailor, putting it into play and now making Sisei unblockable as long as she attacks his opponent with the highest life total. Unfortunately for Mike, he's now Cow's only opponent, so Cow simply has to untap on his turn and attack Mike for a grand total of 36 commander damage with Sisay, knocking him out and winning Cow the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot of fun. Everyone's deck really got the chance to showcase what it could do. Our deck really had one big turn where we got to drop Purphoros the turn before, and then sneak in a Phyrexian Triniform and a Triplicate Titan to make a bunch of golems and hit people for 18 that turn. So it was very, very cool, and I could definitely see where if we'd had a few more turns to really just keep churning out giant creatures, we definitely could have put ourselves in a winning position. But unfortunately, people were well aware that we were doing too much and rightfully took us out. Doodle's deck also did what it wanted to do. It put a lot of things into play that either destroyed creatures or destroyed lands, but he wasn't quite able to get a setup going where he could do both at the same time, which is kind of what the deck is designed to do. It's designed to destroy creatures, lands, and then use Daragaz as a finisher once it comes back in. And I think that him not really having any creatures to block with meant that people just kind of kept hitting him and things got out of hand for him, unfortunately. Moving on to Mike's deck, I think he did pretty well. I think getting Atali into play put him in a winning situation, but he unfortunately kept taking the deal from Cow, and I think that actually hurt him more than we thought at the time, because being unable to attack Cow meant that Cow never really had anything to worry about from Mike's point of view. He knew that Mike couldn't attack him, he knew he couldn't do damage to him, so he could very comfortably take myself and Doodle out of the game before having to worry about Mike, and then just dropped the unblockable Sword Coast Sailor and won the game. So obviously, talking about Cow, he did wind up winning, so a huge shout out to Cow for his victory. But overall, I think his deck did what it wanted to do pretty much to perfection. He got the pieces that he needed for Sisay, he turned her into a massive threat, and then just started systematically eliminating people from the game. Because he eliminated me, the next turn it was Doodle, and the turn after that was Mike, so he very quickly went through, he found ways to protect Sisay to get her to push through damage, and I think it was just overall kind of the perfect synergy for what his deck wanted to do. So a huge shout out to Cow for a super cool deck and a very powerful win. But overall, let me know down in the comments what you thought of the game, let me know what you think of the deck, and of course let me know if there's any cards you'd like to see me build around in the future. So with all of that being said, thank you all so much for watching, thank you all for liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.